So I thought we'd look this week at composing hacks. These are my tips to make composing a bit easier to get started, a bit easier to find new ideas, and a bit easier to develop those ideas. Hack number one is one I take very seriously: collect instruments. I used to find string writing really difficult. You could study those fingering charts all you wanted, but you'd always find you'd written something impossible. And you never fully mastered those myriad of different playing techniques, from barriolage to ricochet bowing. Then one day I managed to get my hands on my granny's old violin. It had gut strings and it barely held together. But as I used it to test out my string lines, it was like the standard of my string writing improved overnight. Now the noises I make on it don't sound particularly pleasing, but they're enough to give me the insight I need to write well for the instrument. So since then I've started collecting instruments whenever the opportunity arises. The French horn comes from an old school friend who no longer plays. The oboe comes from a friend of my wife's whose daughter no longer needed it. The only instrument I still really hanker after is a double bass, so that I can explore those great harmonics it has. Hack number two: sketching with technology. Composing at the computer or by multi-track recording is often looked down on in composing circles, much as composing at the piano used to be. Both are supposedly a sign that your ear is not up to the job. But that rather defensive attitude presupposes that there's only one type of composer and only one way to compose. It's good to remember that some of today's most successful composers have talked freely about their use of technology, whether it's John Adams using sequencer software or Thomas Addis exploring complex layering ideas by playing one part over another pre-recorded piano track. Imagine the world of sculpting. I'm sure there are some sculptors who conceive the entire piece in their minds in minute detail, and the task of sculpting is merely a process of carving them out of the stone. But there'll be many others who have only a blurry idea, and the finished piece is something they only gradually discover as they work on the material, the process itself suggesting new directions to take. For me, working with sketches on the computer has made composition much more of a sculptural process, and it's a way of working that's allowed my music to flourish in a way that it struggled to do in the days before computers. The crucial thing, I think, is not to use it as an orchestration guide, and I outlined a few of the potential pitfalls of that in my orchestration mistakes video. But as a way of grasping how the essential gestures of music flow through time, I think it has tremendous benefits. Sometimes a simple cut or repetition can completely recontextualize a subsequent passage, and being able to quickly test out and get a sense of how such alternatives sit in time can save hours of potentially fruitless labour. If you object to the idea of using technology on the grounds that it will somehow interfere with your creative process, remember that using a pencil is also a piece of technology. Its uses and limitations inevitably affect the way you compose just as much as a computer software or a recording device. As long as you're aware of the potential pitfalls and limitations of the technology you're using, whether it's a pencil, piano, recorder or computer, I think any of them are just as appropriate to use as the others. Hack number three: walking with a smartphone. This may sound a bit obvious, but it took me years to realise that this worked. If you've been sitting at your desk for hours and you feel like your brain's turning to mush, as happens to me most days around 12 o'clock, nothing works better as a reboot than a simple walk in the fresh air. I've lost count of the number of times that a solution or a fresh idea has come to me 5 minutes out the door. In those cases, I found it's invaluable to have my phone with me because, of course, it has a built-in audio recorder. So my phone's filled with nonsensical recorded blitherings that I've made as I walk through the fields of Hertfordshire. Hack number four: listening to very short clips. As a kid, when I listened to pieces for the first time, I often had a sense that I knew what was coming next. And I think this was my compositional instinct showing through already then. If you're stuck for ideas for a new piece, try finding a piece of music you don't know, play the tiniest extract, the opening chord or bar, and ask yourself what comes next. I'm not talking about guessing, I'm talking about listening to your imagination and asking it what you think happens next in your piece of music. If you know the rough ballpark of the kind of piece you want to write, try flicking through a composer or genre that you like on Spotify or wherever, and just listening to 2 seconds of each track. At some point, if you're lucky, a textural chord will leap out at you. Whatever you do, don't play on. Stop the track immediately and imagine where the music will go next. Within no time, you'll be writing your own music. Hack number 5: react to the choice of instruments. A friend of mine who's a playwright has little figures he uses when he's mapping out his plays in advance. It helps him to visualize the characters occupying real 3D space moving on and off the stage. Similarly, if you know the combination you're writing for, whilst you don't have to go out and buy lots of little instruments, really visualizing the combination is a really great way to get ideas flowing. Each instrument has its own principal characteristics and its own way of fitting in within the overall ensemble. As an example, imagine a wind quintet: flute, clarinet, oboe, horn and bassoon. For me, the horn is straight away the odd one out. It's a brass instrument. So that's one potential kind of music right away, horn versus ensemble. Alternatively, you could group the horn and the bassoon together. Certainly in the lower range, the horn has a lot in common with the bassoon. Or you could group bassoon and oboe together by virtue of them both being double reed instruments. So straight away, you've got three different dynamics at play between the instruments, and a huge pointer as to the direction the piece should take. Hack 6, using plugins. Plugins are tiny little programs that you can add onto your music notation software like Sibelius or Finale. Sibelius comes with some, and there are many others on the website you can download for free. Some of the most useful for compositional purposes are simple inversion and retrograde plugins, as well as the scale transformation plugin, which allows you to take a whole passage and instantly hear it in another mode, which can be a lot of fun to play with. If you're into writing process-based music to any extent, I think the potential power of these plugins can't be overstated. You either need a bit of programming knowledge yourself, or there are several plugin writers out there who will happily do the work for you for a pretty modest fee. I experimented with a couple of these myself, one that generated slightly randomized rhythmic spaces within specified limits. If you listen to a John Adams bass line, for example, there's often a sense that it was generated in some kind of way like this. And another one was a sort of advanced scale transformer where you select a chord and it moves the notes within another passage to the nearest note within the chord, effectively modally changing the entire passage. I'm not sure I ended up using either of these, but they certainly opened my eyes to the possibilities of plugins. And as I mentioned in my negative rhythms video, I found another use for them in my latest piece. Hack 7. 2 essential books. There are 2 books which I always keep within arm's reach when I'm composing. There's Blatter's Instrumentation and Orchestration and Elaine Gould's Behind Bars. Blatter's full of useful information about each instrument, particularly the ranges, specifying ranges for amateur and professional, as well as the ones you're usually looking for, these little black dots which signify notes that are still playable but outside the normal playing range. It also has fingering charts and helpful descriptions of various playing techniques. It's pretty comprehensive as far as standard instruments go. What it lacks a little are some of the more extreme extended techniques, and I think the composing community is overdue a really good book delineating those. Elaine Gould's Behind Bars is only 7 years old but has become an instant classic, incredibly comprehensive, outlining with obsessive efficiency the tiniest details of how to notate a manuscript to the highest professional standard, where a slur should fall in relation to a staccato, the different ways to notate a trill or a tremolo, and so on and so on. If you take pleasure from the precision of your notation, I guarantee you'll enjoy this book. I asked my patrons on my new Patreon page for suggestions for composing hacks, and one of the first to come back from David Bennett was about imposing arbitrary restrictions on yourself. As David says, you could use only major ninth chords or write in an odd time signature that you're not used to. Rather than wasting time choosing from the infinite starting places, force yourself through one door and then you should get the ball rolling a lot quicker. I mentioned this idea in my composing with one note video. Restrictions generally are a very good way to stimulate creativity and force you down alleyways you might not otherwise have taken. I'll just give you one example that I've used in the past. Perhaps you've come across the 12-tone technique pioneered by the second Viennese school of composers like Schoenberg and Webern. The basic idea is that all 12 notes are equal and create a row in which you then cycle through each of the pitches in turn to create the piece. Well, how about a row with 20 notes but only a total of 7 pitches? So some of the pitches repeat within the row. This allows you to create a kind of modal sounding piece, not as atonal as a Schoenberg piece, but it still gives you strict limitations on which note you can use next. Hack number 9, games. You can turn those limitations into a kind of game, and there are plenty of other games you can use to stimulate your creativity. If you like your music theory on the quirky side, check out my fellow YouTuber Not Right Music. Although he's more focused on improvisation, many of the ideas he has, such as rolling dice and so on, can be used to help you come up with compositional ideas. Hack number 10, imitate something non-musical. The final hack comes with a personal example from my piano piece Undula. I've always really liked David Hockney's famous Californian paintings, where there was often a really unusual depiction of water. Various kinds of ripples that managed to feel very convincing, while actually being almost an abstract series of wiggly lines. I decided I'd try and create a musical version of that, attempting to create a musical sense of water using only abstract shapes. So the second movement of my solo piano piece, Undula, which is Latin for small waves, just uses this tiny up and down movement to create this little idea. And I then played with overlapping one of those ideas with another, a bit like one wave following another. And before I knew it, the piece was underway. Now I realise this may be an approach that's very personal to me, as I often draw inspiration from visual ideas or atmospheres, but it's certainly one way that's stimulating when it comes to getting those first notes down on paper. I'm very grateful to all the patrons who've already signed up on my new Patreon page. Your support will allow the channel to grow, and I'm really excited where we might take it. On Patreon I post regular mini vlogs, allow you to follow along and make suggestions as I edit new scripts, and generally interact, including the possibility of feedback on your pieces if you're a composer yourself. And I still have a couple of signed CDs available. If you join and put in a request, I'll send you one if they're still available. If there are any good composing hacks I missed out, let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, do please like, subscribe and share with your friends. See you next time.